We are now past the top of the hour, so I think we should get started. So hello everyone, and welcome to this implementation webinar. So I'm Anne Høyen from the SNOMED International's implementation support team. I want to thank you all for attending this webinar. Alejandro, if you could just switch to the next slide. Thank you. Okay, so for today, we have prepared a session which will focus on building questionnaires with SNOMED CT and FHIR. So first, I'm pleased to welcome my colleague Alejandro Lopez Osorio, who will give a presentation on the use of SNOMED CT to represent questions and answers in clinical questionnaires. And after that, we have Paul Lynch from the National Library of Medicine in the US, who will give a presentation demonstrating a standardized approach to the development of clinical questionnaires using HL7 FHIR questionnaire resources with forms provided by the NLM. And we look forward to that presentation too. So if you have any questions as we go along, there will be time to answer questions after each presentation. You can just write them you can click the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and you can raise questions. If it's questions that we can answer as we go along, we'll do it. Otherwise, we'll take them verbally after the presentations. So over to you, Alejandro.
Thank you very much. And so today we have a presentation on questionnaires and SNOMED. And it's interesting because it's something that it's a recurrent question from users to say, how do I represent this questionnaire using SNOMED? And the key here is that it's always not easy to do that only with SNOMED. SNOMED is a fundamental part of representing the meaning of the questionnaire, but you also need to represent the structure in some way. And that's why we thought to have this webinar today, discussing both things, discussing how to represent meaning. And then we invited Paul from NLM, Paul Lynch, to show us tooling they have developed in NLM to represent the structure of questionnaires, and also to bind to the meaning of SNOMED CT. So basically, let's go through the first steps of what are questionnaires and how they are related to SNOMED. So usually questionnaires is a list of questions or items that are used to gather data from respondents about their attitudes, experiences, or opinions. They can be used to collect quantitative or qualitative information. And questionnaires are used a lot in healthcare because they're really useful for many things. They support collection of predefined parameters in a specific domain. So you say, I want to collect all these things that are important for this use case, for this case, for this type of disease, for this type of procedure, etc. But and doing that, it ensures that the data is collected consistently and with the right level of detail for the decisions you need to make after that. And also, it allows you to explicitly capture the presence or absence of specific types of information. In clinical practice, we see questionnaires used a lot for symptoms checklists, for quality of life surveys, for functional assessment, for medical history, for risk assessment, etc. There are many, many use cases, and they're used daily in many years. And they have been using paper for a long time. And now many hospitals are doing the transition to electronic forms, or they did already, but they want to not have just as a random piece of data in their systems, that they want to be integrated with the rest of the electronic health record. So why do we need a questionnaire? What does the questionnaire bring into the table when you use them? If you only have a problem list, like we see on the left, for example, if the patient comes with a sore throat, you will just enter sore throat as a problem there, and you will record the symptom in that way. And if you don't record the symptom, you assume that the patient doesn't have sore throat. But when you use a questionnaire, you say, okay, if you have a patient with fever, you want to be sure if the patient feels ill, if he has cough, if he has difficulty breathing, sore throat, or congestion or runny nose. So in this way, you're sure that you go through all this list of symptoms and you respond either yes or no. So if the benefit of the questionnaire is that you force the practitioner to actually decide whether it's yes or not, to consider this symptom in his assessment. And if you use just a list of symptoms, If the symptom is not there, you don't know if the patient didn't have the symptom or if the practitioner didn't ask about the symptom and the symptom was not recorded, but the patient had it. So this is one of the most important benefits of why people create questionnaires. And the questionnaire have a predefined structure. When you see a questionnaire, you're looking at an information model. This is like a small database that represents the information that is collected. So when you develop a questionnaire, it's important to consider two aspects of that, the structure and the meaning. And there is a way to apply standards both to the structure of the questionnaire and the meaning of the clinical entities referenced in the questionnaire. So one of the use cases for using the standard is to support interoperability. And interoperability has different aspects when you talk about questionnaires. One aspect is that you want to be able to use the same questionnaire in different systems. Yes, if you can represent the questionnaire in an interoperable way, you can render the questionnaire into your EMR, but you can also put the same questionnaire in the patient's portal. If it's self-assessed, you can put it in a mobile application, and you use the same questionnaire definition to show to the patient, the doctor, the nurse in different systems. And that gives you a lot of control about how you want the questionnaire. If you want to add a question or modify the options, you do it once, and that is replicated in all these systems automatically. And you don't need to make software changes in each one of the systems. So it's being able to have an interoperable questionnaire is really important. But you also want to have interoperability in the responses. So you want to capture the responses of the questionnaire in a way that can be integrated with other aspects of the health system. So if in a questionnaire you ask if the patient smokes, you probably want that information to be comparable with other parts of the EHR where you record the smoking status of the patient. So you need that the responses are interoperable as well. And information in questionnaires usually overlaps with other information in other questionnaires also. So sometimes you have asked the same question in different questionnaires. So using standards, you can identify this meaning overlap between different questionnaires. And basically, if you go to the aspects of how SNOMED is applied to the questionnaire, you have two different places where the meaning is important. And that's what is the question and what are the options? And basically we'll work around that. So you may have a questionnaire that says like this one, what are your main symptoms? Yes, and you have a list of symptoms and you can check or not check. So the question is a very generic clinical observation examination observable, and each symptom is a finding, for example. But this can have many shapes. In different questionnaire, maybe you ask the same thing and use the same values to represent that. You have always a question and an answer. In this case, the answer is more explicit in yes, no, instead of a check. So when you go to code that, yes, if you want to code the responses, you have different ways to represent information. And these different ways have different usability later when you want to integrate information with other sources. So one option is that you assign a value to the yes, to say, okay, if the question was click your current diseases and diabetes mellitus is one of them, you can say yes, no, or you cannot reply. One option is to say, okay, if you type yes, if you check the box, you have diabetes mellitus. And if no, you don't have anything else. And then you send diabetes mellitus to your problem list. But other option, maybe that gives you a bit more discrimination, a bit more power, is to record both the question and the answer. So you can say that if you click yes, it's diabetes mellitus associated with the code known present. And this is not an expression. This is just a combination of different information pieces that you know in the questionnaire. If you respond no, you have diabetes mellitus known absent. And if you don't know or don't respond, you can say diabetes mellitus unknown. Yes. Other option is to look for pre-coordinated concepts. Say if you type yes, you select diabetes mellitus, and if you type no, you select a concept that already exists in SNOMED as diabetes mellitus absent. The limitation with this one is that there are not absent concepts for all the findings or disorders. So sometimes you will have a disorder that doesn't have a matching absent situation that will match that. And there are not many concepts for unknown. You can hire a hybrid in which you use the finding or the qualifier, depending on which option. This is a bit more controversial because you're using like different domains. Depending on the answer, you're capturing different parts of SNOMED. The option 2 is much more explicit in that sense. It seems to be the most robust one. And an option for the future is that you could actually create full concepts explaining this. You can use a disorder or a situation post-coordinated, adding the context in the right way. So not just capturing the diabetes and the known absent as different fields in the questionnaire, but or a combination of codes, but rather capturing them as a piece of meaning represented with a post-coordinated expression. Probably this is the most robust one, but not easy to implement with existing tooling. And the SNOMED is working on providing demonstrations of how to use post-coordinated expressions early next year, probably. So how does this work in the example 2, for example, in the option 2 in that list in a real world example? So cough, no, you capture cough and, oh, cough, yes, sorry, capture cough, non-present, or sore throat, yes, non-present. Or if you capture headache with an X in the no, it's headache, non-absent. And if you capture diarrhea and you don't specify any, say diarrhea and no. This is how it will be stored in the information model. But this leads that when you want to use the data for analytics, for decision support, for everything, you need to understand that the information is captured differently in your problem list and in your questionnaire responses. So when you look at the problem list, to know if a person has diabetes, you only look for the concept, type 2 diabetes mellitus, that's fine. If you find the concept, it means that the patient has type 2 diabetes mellitus. But when you do the query to the questionnaire, if you have adopted this pattern of recording both the concept and the modifier, you find the concept to see, do we have information about diabetes mellitus? But then you need to look for the qualifier to be present. And this is the consideration you need to make. If you're consistent in the adoption of this model in all your questionnaires, then this is something that you will probably bake in your data extractions or query processes. So like we said, questionnaires have a meaning and a structure. And we've been talking about how to capture the meaning of the questionnaires. And the next part of the webinar is to discuss how you can capture the structure of the question. Yes, and this structure is provided probably in the best way by FHIR. HL7 FHIR has resources especially dedicated to capturing questionnaires and test questionnaire responses. And that's why we have invited Paul to describe his work. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Alejandro. Yeah, one of the things that Alejandro and I talked a lot about in the preparation of this webinar is how the questionnaires differs maybe from many places in an electronic health record, is the fact that contextual information is often made very explicit. And being consistent in how you represent that contextual information and understanding the model is therefore essential in order to get the full value out of the questionnaire answers, so that you remember to every time you do a query to not only look at the present findings, but also the absent findings. You can do a much more thorough analysis, but you need to include the contextual information. So the next presenter now is Paul Lynch, and Paul Lynch is a staff scientist at the US NLM National Library of Medicine. He's the technical lead of the FHIR Tools project, which includes LHC Forms widget for rendering FHIR questionnaires and the NLM form builder for building them. Paul has degrees in both computer science and in physics and mathematics, and aside from that, he enjoys building tools, widgets, and APIs, which are useful for others. And we are pleased that you have that enjoyment, Paul. And now we look forward to learn from you. So welcome, and thank you for being here.
Thank you. All right, so I'll share my slides. Let's see. Okay. All right. Can everyone see my screen?
Yes, we see your screen.
Okay. All right, great.
Thank
All
you.
right. So yeah, so I'm going to talk about give a little background on FHIR questionnaires and FHIR, and then talk about the tools that we have at the U.S. National Library of Medicine for working with FHIR questionnaires. Here we go. All right, so I just want to point out our project page URL here. It's lhcforms.nlm.nih.gov, which has links to our tools that I'll be talking about a little bit later in the presentation. So LHC Forms is our widget that we developed for rendering FHIR questionnaires. So it's a tool you can put on any web page and show a FHIR questionnaire. But first I'm going to talk about FHIR questionnaires, and then the NLM form builder, and then apps for viewing questionnaires. So FHIR, just a little background in case not everyone is familiar with FHIR. So it stands for Fast Healthcare Interoperability Resources, and it's a standard from HL7, which is Health Level 7, for exchanging healthcare data. So FHIR divides up data types into resources. So there are different resources for things like patient, condition, observation, and also questionnaire. And each resource is represented as a hierarchical structure. So you have a set of fields in resource, and then the fields have subfields and so on. When exchanged, the format is typically XML or JSON. So there's a sort of a summary page, like an executive level summary page about FHIR here, and it includes a section about why FHIR is better. So I'm just going to point out this link. I won't go through it, but it's under, so hl7.org/FHIR is the sort of the main website for the specification, and then this summary page is where you'll find the summary and the list of selling points for FHIR. Okay. So FHIR is very much under active development, and the resources go through stages of stability. So there are many resources that have made it all the way to the normative stage, in which basically there are no more breaking changes allowed at that point. Then there are some at trial use where there are some, you can still have some breaking changes, but it's sort of stable. So questionnaire is in that state, although it's expected to go normative probably with not the next release, but so which is R5, but the R6 probably will go normative. And then there's draft. Draft is you almost don't want to use because it's likely to be completely rewritten. But if you really want to play with what people are thinking about, you could try something in the draft stage. Questionnaire, I mean, although it's trial use, it's still there haven't been really major changes from between. So there are different releases of FHIR as a whole. So you have S23, which was stands for standard for trial use, and then R4, which has had the first normative content in it. And then so there haven't really been huge changes between S23 and R4 and R5 for questionnaire. It's just like a couple of fields were renamed, or in one case the data types for the questionnaires were tweaked a little bit. So it's quite usable as it is my point. So anyway, so with the releases, basically the point of the release is it kind of freezes the specification, even though it's under development. It freezes at a specific point, so you can know what you're targeting with your applications, or you can say that I'm supporting R4, and then something else that wants to communicate with your system can also, if they support R4, then they can talk with you without a problem. So FHIR also defines an API for searching FHIR resources on FHIR servers, and the resource data will normally, just for efficiency and better indexing, will store it in some other non-FHIR format. But then when you are sending resources to the server to store stuff, or if you're pulling resources out of the server, that would be in the FHIR format of the resources that we'll look at in just a bit. So I want to mention this link for how to search a FHIR server. I'm not going to go into that in detail, but but basically you have the base URL for a FHIR server followed by a resource type like questionnaire or condition or something like that. And then you have a set of search parameters that follow, so name value pairs usually. And the search parameters, there are some search parameters that are defined for all the resources. But then there are also each resource, so there'll be a page for each resource, and I'll show that in a second, but they'll define its own search parameters specific for that resource. Okay, so if you were, so there are a number of, there are client applications which produce things like questionnaires or maybe capture data for questionnaires, and then there are FHIR servers which store and manage the data. So depending on which one you're using, you might need a FHIR server. So there are different options for that. There are cloud services that provide FHIR servers. The one that we're using at NLM is an open source package called HFHIR. It's free, you can download it. There's also a commercial version of it, which you can get and then get support for. But there are also, if you don't want to go to the trouble of setting up your own FHIR server, or don't need to, there are a bunch of public FHIR servers you can use for testing. And so this is a list actually that was put together for the FHIR Connectathons, which happen 3 times a year. But you can see there are quite a number of them you could potentially choose from. And these test servers, just be aware that they probably reset their data periodically, so you wouldn't want to store anything there long term, and you wouldn't want to use them in like a as your storage for your production application or something. But if you just want to play around with it, that's certainly fine. All right, so FHIR questionnaires. So forms in FHIR are represented as the resource called questionnaire, and that actually represents a blank form. Then answers that a user enters, the questions get stored in another resource called questionnaire response, which then points back to the questionnaire it came from. So that it's a sort of, so there can be a lot of definition data in the questionnaire resource that then doesn't have to get repeated in each questionnaire response resource. Questionnaire response resources will generally have the question text and the answers and not much else. Okay, so I'm going to show 2 things about questionnaires here. One is an example questionnaire, and we'll look at a few of the fields and the structure there. Then we'll go to the specification for the questionnaire resource, so you can see what kinds of things are defined there as well. So the example won't cover everything that's in the specification. But, all right, so this is a URL on our FHIR server. So this is the base URL for our FHIR server. It's in our 4 FHIR server, and then you can see the resource type questionnaire there. And then if you do this kind of syntax where you just have a string after the questionnaire or after the resource type, indicates that this is an ID that you're looking for. So I can point to a particular questionnaire or a particular FHIR server. So and then this is a HFHIR server. So what it does for its default view is it provides an HTML view of the resource, which just provides things like line numbers and nice coloring. If you wanted to see what the actual raw resource looks like, you can see that too. And you can also download an XML version of it. But it's a little bit easier to look at in the HTML view. So in the JSON version, each resource declares its resource type, so you know what you're looking at. And then you'll see that the fields are actually part of the resource below that. So the ID here is actually, so it's a unique ID, but only on this particular FHIR server. So other FHIR servers, if you asked for this ID, you might not get the same questionnaire. Now this is actually a Lynch code, so it would probably be pretty close to this questionnaire if you found it on another FHIR server, but it doesn't have to be. It could be like ID 43 or something. So then you'll see there's a meta section, and the important thing there is the FHIR server generates a timestamp when you store the resource on the FHIR server. You've got the title for the questionnaire, a status. Then you have a code which actually, so this bracket means what follows is a list of codes, and there's just one of them here. And then the open brace means that it's an object with these properties. So this is what FHIR calls a coding, which is a triplet of the code system, and then the display string. So those come up a lot in FHIR. Let's see. So then the actual questions, which are, I guess, arguably the important part of the questionnaire, are stored under something called item. And then each item has its own fields. One field is the link ID, which is used. It's a unique identifier for the question within the questionnaire. So it wouldn't be unique across questionnaires, but it's what's used to tie the answers in the questionnaire response back to the question that's in the questionnaire. You also see an array of extension objects. So FHIR it doesn't define everything as a top-level field in its structures. It will put a lot of information into extensions, and so it just keeps the specification from getting too large. But I'll talk more about extensions later. But so you can see here it's defining unit options. So this is a question about the patient's weight, and the user has an option to specify that either in kilograms or pounds by putting these two extensions. All right, so I think let me just check my notes about what I was going to cover. Okay, wait. So let's go on to the specification at this point. Yeah, missed a link. Here we go. Okay, so this is the questionnaire page, and it doesn't have a version number after it. So if we went to R4, then it would be the R4 version of FHIR. So this link actually is whatever the current last published version of the questionnaire is. You can also see that there's a link here for each. This shows up on each, at least each resource page, which is a directory of published versions. So you could go back to SQ3 if you wanted to. So down here at the bottom, I'm going to skip past that for just a second. So I just want to point out that down here at the bottom, you'll see it's usually the last thing on the resource page is the search parameters for searching the resource. It shows you what things you could do a query for to find questionnaires. But the important section I wanted to go over is and this is on each resource page too, there'll be a structure section which covers the structure of what's actually in the resource. So you see the fields and, the cardinality, which indicates, is it optional? Is there at least one required, or can there be multiple of these things? And then of course the data type. Also for some things, you will see, so things that have a type code or a coding or a codable concept will generally have a list that indicates what those codes should come from. And those types can either be example lists, like here, which means just to give you an idea what you might put there, or they can be extensible, which means you should choose from that list if you can, otherwise you're free to add your own, or it can be required. So like the publication status, you have to choose one of these 4 statuses, and nothing else is accepted. Also here at the top, you'll see that the questionnaire inherits from another resource called domain resource, and that also inherits from another resource, and so on. So basically what that does is it defines, it's going to inherit fields from its ancestor resources. And the one I want to point out in particular is this contained resource here. Contained lets you store other resources inside your questionnaire. So if you wanted, so that FHIR, for instance, FHIR defines another resource called the value set, which you can think of as, it's basically a list of codings. So those triples, the code system and display strings. And so if you wanted to sort of make answer lists that are these arrays of codings sort of contained in your questionnaire, then you can put it in a contained section, and then you use those answer lists in the actual questions that you're referring to. So you could have multiple questions all pointing to the same value set, would be the point of doing that. There's a simpler way of representing an answer list too, if you just have an answer list that's going to be used on one question. But we'll cover that down below. So, so in addition to title, there's also So title is the name for the questionnaire that's supposed to be for people to read. There's also a name for the questionnaire, which, and I just clicked on that. So let me just interrupt myself. So when you click on it, you get to a more full description of each field. And then if you just, you'll get like a shorter explanation here, more concise. Anyway, so the name field is for supposed to be computer friendly. So you could do a search on the name. I guess you could do a search on title as well. But anyway, so with a name field, it's not supposed to have spaces or special characters or things like that. Right. So you can also derive a questionnaire from another questionnaire. You can at least say that this questionnaire is based on some other questionnaire. All right, so let's move on to the items. So we talked about link ID. So you can also, so each item should have a type declared, and here it's a required list of types. So I'm going to go look at that. So when you click on one of these links that define the list, you actually get the full list of values it can have, assuming it's a required type. So there's so for the type, you can define a type that's a group. So that's a question which has other child items underneath of it. And you can also define a display item, which as an item that doesn't have child items, but it basically functions as a heading in the questionnaire. And I should have said when I said group, it has child items, but also it is not asking a question itself. It's just, it's like a heading with questions underneath it. And then the other types are actual things that are collecting data. So you can see the different data types here. The two ones that are, so this is something that's changing in R5. We have currently have these two choice and open choice types, which are actually both, the type is actually coding. But they're used for basically for answer lists of codings. So the difference between choice and the open choice is if it's choice, the user has to pick one of the codings from the answer list. And if it's open choice, the user can either pick one of the answer list options or could enter a string it's off the list. See, so also there's enable when, which lets you say whether a question shows up or not on the form, and you might base that on actually so the way it lets you do that is you can say that it's based on whether another question has been answered or has a particular answer. So you can say, so here you're pointing to the link ID of another question, and you're giving an operator and saying either it exists or it's equal to something, or if it's numeric, it's greater than some value. And then you're putting in a value here that you're going to compare using that operator to say whether it exists or not. You can have more than one of those conditions. So you could have your question show up based on answers to multiple questions, some combination of those. And then if you do that, then you would want to specify enable behavior, which controls whether all of the criteria have to be satisfied or just one of them. Then, of course, you have, typical things like whether the question is required or not, whether it repeats or not, which means you can have more than one answer, or if it's a group, whether the whole group can have more than one instance if the user requests it. Whether the question is read-only. You can also, in addition to read-only, you can make questions completely hidden in the form, which is useful maybe if you have a score calculation that you don't want the user to see. So answer value set is where I was pointing to before, or talking about before with the contained value set idea, is that you could point this to that one of those contained value set and say that the answer list for this question is in that value set, and it should use that. It doesn't have to be a contained value set. It could also, if you wanted to have an answer list that was used on more than one questionnaire, it could be an external value set, a resource on its own in a FHIR server somewhere, and then you would just point to it using the canonical URL to point to the value set. The simpler option for making answer lists is just to do answer option, and then you don't have to worry about making a value set. But then that limits the usefulness to just that one question for the answers, for the answer list. So then we have initial values. So you might want some default values to show up when the questionnaire is first loaded. You can use that. And then there's this just shows that an item can contain items, so it has that recursive structure to it. So you can have items and sub-items and so on. Right. Let's see. Okay, so other questionnaire related resources. I've already talked about value set, questionnaire response briefly. And I just want to also mention observation. So observations, you can sort of think of them as holding generally a single measurement like weight or height or systolic blood pressure or something like that. Though they can have components, there's ways to say that this observation is connected to these other observations. But the usefulness there for questionnaire is that you can, after you've collected the data in the questionnaire response, you can do, if you've marked up the questionnaire this way, you can do an extraction of the data out into observations, which then makes that data usable in other questionnaires, or searchable, more findable in the system in general. So that if you have questionnaires with different formats and structures, you don't have to, if you want to find the weight data for a patient, you can just look in observations rather than trying to search through questionnaires and find different questions. Right. So I'll sort of just mention a couple things about implementation guides. So the core FHIR basically is trying to satisfy the use cases in which are used by maybe 80% of implementers, because if you tried to make a specification that would cover every possible case that any implementer might possibly want in the future, it would be huge. And so it's actually pretty big just with that 80% goal. So other functionality gets added in via extension objects, which can live on any part of the resource. Even things like string values can have extensions on them. So some of those extensions are defined in FHIR itself, but also through implementation guides. And those are basically documents that provide guidance about recommended approaches to solve certain types of problems through FHIR. So the one that's, or one of them that's relevant for FHIR questionnaires is the Structured Data Capture Implementation Guide, which is published here. And this STU3 means that the implementation guide is it's the third version of the implementation guide, which is a standard for trial use, but it's actually targeting R4 FHIR. Now this I'm not going to go into in detail because it would be like another half an hour presentation, but I just want to sort of point out what's here. So it's a pretty big specification. You can think of it basically as an implementation guide that covers all of the fancy stuff that you might want to do with questionnaires. And but you don't have to absorb all of it. It's broken up into sections. And so there's a section on advanced form rendering. So if you wanted to put bold tags or CSS into some of your form title or questions text, you can do that. There's also calculated, you can do things with FHIR path expressions to calculate values based on other values in the questionnaire. Those can be either, like initial default values, or they can continually update while the user is editing the form. You can have answer lists that are computed on the fly. Modular forms are basically, it covers an approach which for assembling questionnaires from smaller pieces, so you could potentially reuse a chunk of a questionnaire and another questionnaire. Adaptive forms talk about questionnaires where there isn't a, there's some systems where there isn't a defined questionnaire, there's just a big pool of questions, and then which question the user gets next depends on what they've answered previously. And they just see that one question at a time. Form population is, so it would be like pulling in data from the patient record, maybe from observations, maybe from the patient resource, and sort of pre-populating the questionnaire that the user sees when they're as like default values. And then data extraction is the opposite of population, which I talked about before, is you can extract into observations or into other resources. The easy case is observations, and that's the one our tools have implemented so far. So anyway, so just be aware that that's there. If there's something in the core questionnaire or specification that, or something that's not in the core specification that you would want, you can look here and see if you can find it. Let's see. All right, so now I'm going to get into a demo of our form builder for questionnaires. So this is the website lhcformbuilder.lm.nih.gov. There's also a link to this from our main project page, LHC Forms, which I pointed to earlier. So it can be used to build either STU3 or R4 questionnaires. It's open source, so you can modify it and run your own version if you want. You can make, so it has some integration with Lynch. You don't have to use Lynch, but what we have a database of Lynch questions and panels, so we connected it to it. You can, so some FHIR features are not yet supported, or it's still under development. Depending on what you want to do, you might need to add some by hand. So what you would do is you'd maybe use our tool to get a starting point for a questionnaire, and then if there's some extensions that we're missing that you need, then you would just edit those in by hand into the JSON. And you can also, if there's a feature you need, you can also send me an email, let me know, because it helps us prioritize, what we should work on next. So we recently rewrote it as an Angular application because the old version was written in AngularJS, which lost support. The new version still has a few bugs in it. So for now, anyway, the old version is still available. I'll show you how to get to that. So, okay, with that, let's get into our demo. So first, because we're connected to Lynch, it wants you to be aware of the Lynch terms of use. And with Lynch, one of the key things is just not to change the meaning of their codes. So when you look at this, let me get rid of that. Okay, so one of the nice things about the new version is that when you come in, it asks you, do you want to start from where you left off before? So it remembers whatever you last worked on. I wouldn't rely on that feature. I would always recommend, saving your work as a file, and I'll show you how to do that. And you can also store it on a FHIR server, but I think the file is the best option. Also up here, I want to point out there's the link to the previous version that you can get to. And so the previous version is pretty similar to this new version in terms of the flow of how it works. I don't think you'll have trouble figuring that out if you need to use it. So here I'm going to start with an existing form. So you could start from scratch. You can, for an existing form, you can load in a file that you've saved previously, or maybe you've downloaded it from the form builder previously. You can import it from a FHIR server, or you can download a panel from Lynch, which is what I'm going to do. All right, so I'm going to pull in. Just going to pull in a panel that has a few questions already, filled in, so we can look at things. So, whatever option you picked on the previous page, you end up here at the form level attribute screen for the next screen, which is a very abbreviated version of the top level attributes from the FHIR specification. We're trying to keep things simpler for most users, but we do. One of the things we need to do is add some way to actually enter the other values if you did want to, set something like the form name in addition to the title. After entering the title, the thing to do would be go to editing questions. And so the way this page works is there's a tree on the left that shows you the structure of the questionnaire. So you can see this one has some top level questions in it, and also some subsections, and then the subsections have questions. And then whichever one you pick, the properties for that item then will show up here, and so you can enter or edit the question text, and it updates. If it's a choice list or open choice, you can enter answer choices for the, and if you've pulled it in from Lynch, then it pulls it in and calculates the answer choices for you. Conditional display is what we're calling enable when. So if I wanted to make this question here, BP method 2 only depend on heart rate, I could do that. It doesn't really make sense to do that, but I could, just as an example. So heart rate. So you could say that this BP method 2 question should only show up if heart rate is greater than 150. And then if we go, so there's this preview button up here, and that will show what the questionnaire looks like. You can click on it as you're, developing your form. You see how things are coming out. So this is our LHC forms questionnaire rendering widget that I mentioned earlier. As you can see what it looks like. So you'll see here that below BP mean was the BP method question, and it's not showing up because the heart rate hasn't been filled in and it doesn't have a value greater than 150. But as soon as I hit 151, then the question shows up. So it's just an example of how enable when works. All right. I think I will move on to the our options for viewing questionnaires. So we have 2 demo applications which are useful for questionnaires. You can also, as I just showed, you could view it in the preview button in the form builder itself. But if you the easier way to do it, if you just have a questionnaire you want to look at, would be to go to our demo for the LHC forms widget. And this is mostly useful when so if you're not connecting to a FHIR server to do pre-population or extraction, then this is an easy place to go. So it has this load from file button, and then if you just click on a file that you've downloaded or created, you can bring up the questionnaire and show it. And this little form is actually using some FHIR path to count the number of questions that have answers, but it's also counting itself, so that's why there's a 1 there. But if I put in 23, you can see it updates to 2. So that's using a calculated expression and the structured data capture implementation guide from that guide. So the other demo to show is our what we're calling the SDC for structured data capture questionnaire smart app. And smart means the smart on FHIR standard, which is a standard for connecting FHIR-based clients to FHIR servers, where there's usually there'll be some if it's real patient data, you would need some authentication process to get there. So there's this standard for connecting and handling the authentication. A part of that would be normally that the EHR would say, okay, I want to allow this app to have access to this FHIR server, and then you'd be able to connect to it. So anyway, so if it will let you, so if you don't go through the Smart on FHIR launch process, well, when you do go through the FHIR launch process, the Smart on FHIR launch process, you end up at this questionnaire here, questionnaire URL. So if you just, if you just go directly to this URL without going through the Smart on FHIR launch process, then you can enter your own FHIR server URL. So if you want to connect to a FHIR server that doesn't have a Smart on FHIR connection, you can just enter your own. But anyway, so let's see what it looks like. So this is going to go through sort of a simulated connection to a fake EHR system. So it doesn't really matter here how you log in, it just accepts it, but it just gives you an idea of how it might look if it were real. And then you get to pick a patient, and this is all fake patient data. So here again, you could use the upload button to upload a file for your questionnaire if you wanted to try out your pre-population or extraction with the FHIR server that it's connected to. Or you could pick one of the featured questionnaires, and I'm going to do that just to show an example. So here you see it filled in some values, and that's doing the pre-population. If we change the values, let's make this 80 and 90. And then one of the options when you save, this would be so we can show test extraction. you can save as questionnaire response and observations, and then it will do the observation-based extraction. So then once you've done that, it shows you what it created, and you can actually go and look on the FHIR server and see what that looks like. I can't actually see that now, but anyway, so you can you can see the JSON basically for those observations. And then so the interesting thing there is, so now that I've done that, it has saved these two observations, 80 and 90 for weight and height. And if I go to another questionnaire, so remember those two values, which also asks the same questions with the same code, then it can find those. It basically just takes the latest one, and the latest one is the one I just saved. So now it's showing up with those values. And it's also doing some population of the birth date and the name as well. So if you're curious about what that looks like in the questionnaire, there's an option for viewing what it is you're looking at. So you can sort of see, see how the FHIR path is constructed for the name, how questions are marked up for extraction, pre-population, and that sort of thing. That's also all covered in the STC implementation guide. And let's see, that might be, get back to the slides. Oh yeah, so I did. There is one more thing I wanted to show. So so there's a data set called RX terms, which is for prescription drugs, and the form there is actually a FHIR questionnaire. So this is just another demonstration of things you can do with FHIR questionnaire. So here it's doing a query to a FHIR server for this drug list based on what the user has typed, and when you pick it, it will get the strength list for the drug. So it does another query, you get the strength list, and then it can fill in the value for the RX QE for that drug. So just to give you an idea of what things you can do with FHIR questionnaires. All right, I think that is it. So a good place to ask if you're working with questionnaires and you have questions about them, there's a site called chat.phir.org. And there's a questionnaire stream on there that you can post questions to about FHIR questionnaires. Also, if you have questions about our tools, you can feel free to send me an email. And I guess that's it.
Thank you very much, Paul. I think it's amazing the job you have done. And I think it was nice to see the complexity of the FHIR resources and how you simplify that with your interfaces. It's much using the form editor, you're actually making life easy for many people. So I think it's really interesting. I'd like just to comment on how the examples were long based, but actually FHIR is abstract in the code system that you use, and you always have like the code system selection and the code. So for the answers and for the questions, you can use SNOMED codes in all.
Absolutely.
Of them. Yeah, exactly. And we use this opportunity to start our discussions with Paul to start thinking about how we can help in the integration of the terminology server in the tool to make it even more simple to access SNOMED content from the tool itself. So I think a new path starts for us to collaborate and try to see how we can do that. So I think it's a very nice opportunity. It's a great presentation. Thank you, Paul.
Yes, I will just second that. Thank you for your presentation, Paul. There are some questions in the chat.
Okay.
So let's go through them. So Sally is asking if you can generate a unique ID for each participant, and if so, the standards for generating the unique identifiers. What? So
would that be a participant like a patient?
I think it depends probably on who the respondee is. If it's a patient, probably I would expect this to be relating to how do you generate like an instance identifier associated with a person.
So there's an instance identifier that would live on the server, So when you create a resource on the FHIR server, it will assign you an ID. So you can either have your own ID that you want, and sometimes, if it hasn't been taken, it will use it, or it will assign one for you. But as far as like So I think that's probably what the question's asking, but feel free to ask if.
Yes, Ali, if you can provide some more details on it, please go ahead. And in the meantime, we can just look at the other question raised by Sally about having the questionnaire in multiple languages. Yeah,
so actually, I was that was raised at the last Connectathon by someone I met there, and so I started working on that. I haven't gotten very far with it. I was able to put in some support for. So there's a translation extension in FHIR, so you can mark up a questionnaire. Any of the strings can have this translation extension with specifies the language code and what the text should be in that language. So I've been working on for our form renderings package, LHC forms, support for that extension. So the user could potentially pick a different language and then see the question text and the title show up in that. It's a little more complicated when you get into question and answers, but I'm working on that too. So.
Okay, so we'll need to keep an eye open for that. Thank you. So John Snyder is asking, are answer list value sets extensible, or how is it defined if the value set is extensible or not? So probably whether or not you can add options.
Yeah, so you can compose a value set from like different coding systems, different sources, or just make up your own answers. So within the questionnaire, basically you get to choose what shows up for the answer list.
So that depends on the approach you take to creating your value sets, how it's extensible or not.
Right. So if you like for a value set resource, it's maybe the question is, if you have a value set, can you extend it? Can you add another? So or can you base another value set off of another value set? That I'm not sure of. Usually they're based off of code systems.
If you were using SNOMED CT and created a value set intentionally using a query, I would assume if you wanted to add to that value set, you would need to then redefine your query or have a separate approach to add members to that value set.
Well, so a FHIR value set basically is a collection of, you're saying that these are the things that are in this value set.
Yeah.
And if you wanted, I'd have to look at the value set resource and see if there's a way to say, I want this value set resource plus this other one.
It must be some.
You can always make your own value set resource and just sort of copy in what was in that one that you wanted, and then add it to your own. But if you wanted it in a way to say that whatever this value set changes to or becomes, I want it plus this other stuff. That I'm not sure.
It's similar to having a code system, a FHIR code system, where you can create a supplement. I'm not sure if you can create supplements for value sets.
For value sets. Yeah, I don't know about that. Yeah.
Okay. The next one is also from John, asking about if there's a way to prevent a user from associating an intentionally defined value set as an answer list definition, or if this is something that is expected. Okay, so that how I understand this is there a way to restrict users from using specific value sets?
So intentionally, that's interesting.
Intentionally is when you do it by query. So when you, and that's what I mentioned before. So you can create a SNOMED value set intentionally. Say we want this value set to be all the disorders except from findings, specific findings. For example, skin findings. So you can make exclusions as part of your query to when you specify a value set.
So yeah, I'm not sure why you would want to prevent that. But
I think it's if you have options in your value set that are definitely not valid as answers to a certain questions, to a certain question.
Then I mean, so you should be able to define your value set to exclude those options, I would think. But
yeah, so that would happen as part of your value set definition, that you make sure that your value set excludes the things that you don't want to include. Yeah, I would agree. Then we have Dilvin asking, how do I process a questionnaire to make changes to the FHIR data? I'm a bit unsure about
So
it.
I think it's probably asking about the questionnaire response resource. Maybe about data extraction. So you can save the questionnaire response to a FHIR server directly, and then there are mechanisms defined in the structured data capture implementation guide for extracting data from the questionnaire response into other resources, for instance, observation or other things like condition that you might want to do. So depending on what it is you want to do for that extraction, there's sort of different levels of complexity for the solution.
Okay. So where are we? So John also just gave a very nice comment to you here about a very good and exciting presentation. So thank you for that, John. Yep. Alejandro, so there's also a question for you about the implications for different ways to code SNOMED CT when it comes to querying.
Let me see.
Yeah.
Question to Alejandro. What are the implications for way to code? Yeah, it's only, I mean, the basic implication is that you need to be aware of what approach you use so you cannot locate information the same way. That was the example of, for example, if you want to capture the context of present or absent separate from the finding, you need to be aware of that and always ask for the context when you're collecting information from the questionnaire responses. So this is why you probably want to have a very constant and consistent way of representing content in your questionnaire.
And then I think the principles about how you perform terminology binding in general applies equally to questionnaires as for any implementation of electronic health records or other clinical information system. So that you would use procedures to capture the meaning of a procedure, while you would use a clinical finding to capture the options that you would often use in a value set. For example, for questions, what are the symptoms? You would use clinical findings.
And you're right, because, for example, allergies or family history are parts of the clinical record where you need to make similar decisions. You want to make, if you want to record family history, will you use a situation concept or you will use the finding plus the family member? So yeah, it's like when you design your terminology bindings, you design these things, you make decisions, they're consistent, and then when you collect information, you take into account those decisions.
Yes.
So
the last one here from Ken is, oh, it's not the last, oh, there are many, it's good. So for implementers using alternate languages for value sets, should translations be implemented using the translation extension or the code system designation element?
Yeah, so that's why, that's one of the things I mentioned when I said things got more complicated for answerless. So if our form rendering software has to go and fetch the code system designations for the thing, the value set expansion, then it's slower and also more complicated. So I would rather just have to look at the translation extension. But I think I have to support both probably. So, but it probably would be more efficient for the form rendering software if they were on translation extensions.
In the extension.
Yeah.
And this is about performance. It's a question for me.
Yeah, it's about performance. So if these are, it's like how when do you make that query out to the FHIR server? Is it when the form loads and to wait till the user decides to switch to German or something and fetch the translation? There's just more to fetch if you have to go out for the designation elements.
Okay.
It would still, I mean, it should still.
It would still work, but
yeah, it's just a little slower.
So I heard it as the translation extension would probably be the approach that you would recommend.
It's probably what I'll start with, and then probably I'll add support for going for the designations.
Okay, then we have James saying it's great to see an illustration of FHIR as a common denominator for interoperability and how the meaning is augmented by SNOMED CT. Thank you. So thank you. And this is, as Alejandro also said, really what we want to emphasize here, that we can have a good model, we can have a good terminology, but if we want to really make the meanings explicit, we need both. And that's why these showcases are super important in terms of achieving interoperability. So I can just second your comment there, James. And Suma is also saying a great presentation. Thank you to everyone. That's lovely.
Thank you.
So we'll just leave it just a minute to see if more questions come in. And in the meantime, yeah, I can just encourage everyone who is out there doing questionnaires to have a look at this and to start building them using FHIR questionnaires and getting some experience in how to bind these questionnaires to SNOMED CT value sets. So thank you everyone for joining this session, and to Alejandro and Paul for presenting today. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
So thank you. Bye-bye.